the thank you, Alexa. Okay, so first of all, the Torah tells us that we are witnesses of God. Now, what exactly that means is type of an interesting question. But one of the ideas, I think, is that our existence as a nation and the way in which we celebrate and preserve our history is really a testimony to that. The Jewish people, our national character and many of our activities have been shaped by the Exodus. So it's central. In fact, when God introduces himself to the Jewish people in the Ten Commandments, he actually says, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." It's interesting that God does not say, "I am the Lord your God who created everything, space, time, the cosmos." No, he says, "I'm God, took you out of Egypt," because that's personal. That's part of our experience. That's part of our history. And it's really important. And indeed, we are told in the Torah to remember the day that you came out of Egypt. There are something, and our entire calendar, today is Rosh Chodesh, our calendar is based on that. And every single festival in the Jewish calendar is based on, to some degree, on the Exodus. This, by the way, behind me is from the Cairo Geniza. There was a large Jewish community who lived in Egypt until the 1960s. 40s and 60s, they left en masse, went to Israel on the whole. But until then, there was a large community. This is a Haggadah found in a synagogue in a synagogue called the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, which was built in 1025. And this is a 1,000-year-old Haggadah, sections of it. And on the, just above me, over my head, is an Aramaic translation and instructions, and on the left, on the left is actually the text of the Haggadah. So Jews have been sitting there and telling the Haggadah to their children, well, approximately 30 or so generations, every 30 years or so. So, 100 generations every 30 years. Right, and so it's about 3,300 years since the Exodus, and so it's not that many people. You know, I heard it from my father, he heard it from his father, he heard it from his father, so on and so forth. Right, grandparents, grandchildren, and so on. We get back to the Exodus, the story told, and here, of course, are just above us. We have the 5 questions. I know you're thinking 4, but in this Haggadah, they had 5 questions, because one of the questions they asked, why on all other nights do we eat all types of meat? Tonight, only roasted lamb in the days of the temple. So it's type of interesting to see that. That's the 5th question. And our calendar, the Jewish calendar, of course, as we know, is based on the Exodus. In fact, the first month of the Jewish year is the month in which the Exodus occurred, because as opposed to Rosh Hashanah, which commemorates the creation of humanity, Exodus commemorates the creation of the Jews. And consequently for us, this is month number 1. Rosh Hashanah, which is like the universal anniversary of creation, is on the 7th month of our calendar. So our calendar also is part of that testimony to Egypt. And so many commandments in the Torah, 35 in total. We're not going to go through all of them, but so many commandments in Torah reference back to this event. This don't oppress the stranger. You were strangers in Egypt. If a stranger dwells in your land, don't do him wrong. You were strangers in Egypt. And again, don't use false weights and measures. Because you were strangers in Egypt. Don't take advantage of people. Don't oppress the widow, the orphan, the poor. The Torah is continuously referencing back to Egypt, and of course, our observance of Shabbat. As you probably know, there are 2 sources for it in the Torah itself, 2 primary major sources. One says Shabbat commemorates creation, but the other one says, remember, right above me, remember you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And so therefore, Shabbat is designed to, yes, God took us out of Egypt. Shabbat is designed to get Egypt out of us. So the fact that the Jewish people So we have all these reminders of the Exodus: Passover, Shabbat, the festivals, even the mezuzah, where it's placed on the door, reminiscent of the blood on the doorpost, tefillin, which have within them parchments that mention the Exodus from Egypt, 4 parchments from the Torah, our prayers, which we refer to as our justice system, the treatment of strangers, slaves, widows, orphans, etc. All of this based on the Exodus. So, and I should point out that there are certain unique features of the Torah stories. Number one, publicity, meaning unlike revelation stories in most religions, which happen to take place in private or in just an elite group of disciples, the Torah stories take place in front of large amounts of people. Our stories also involve not just getting, if you're peckish and getting some food, they actually involve survival. There is a continuity of these events. They were not just one-time events. And we will see that there is interesting confirmation of some of these events. Now let's look at the forensics. First of all, we'll start with the event that brought the Jews down to Egypt, which was the sale of Joseph. When Joseph was sold as a slave, the Torah interestingly mentions that he was sold for 20 pieces of silver, 20 shekels. And so K.A. Kitchen has done an analysis of the cost of slaves in different parts of the Middle East at different times, and you'll see the various bars. The green bars indicate the price of a male slave. Interestingly, when the Torah says Joseph was sold, that was the price of a slave is accurate as 20 shekel. I point this out because, if I would ask anyone here, I don't know, how much did a man's suit cost at Sears Roebuck in 1901? Most of you would not know. We happen to have a Sears catalog from 1901 at home, so we can actually look it up. But knowing details like that indicates a knowledge of the very intimate knowledge of the reality. So Joseph is taken down to Egypt. And of course, when he's down there, as we know, he interpreted a huge part of the story is his interpretations of Pharaoh's dreams. Now, it's interesting. Here, right next to me, is a dream manual from the British Museum. It's a papyrus from a scribe called Kenher Kopeshev, and basically it gives rules and guidance for interpreting dreams. In Egypt, dreams were an important part of the culture. And one of the jobs of Pharaoh's advisors was to interpret dreams. So when the Torah tells us that Joseph rose to power through the interpretation of dreams, this is very much in keeping with the character and the nature of ancient Egypt. There is a Thutmose dream stealer. Now, we also know that Egypt was very famous for bread. In fact, it's called in ancient Egyptian the land of Chem, which means the black land, referring to the rich soil from the inundation of the Nile. In Hebrew, it's called Eretz B'nai Cham, Cham, sons of Cham. But Cham also means warm, but it also means brown, very similar to the Egyptian, the black land. In fact, from the word Cham comes the Arabic alchimia, from which comes the English alchemy and chemistry, and from which comes the Hebrew lechem, bread, and chametz, leavened bread. So, as type of interesting, the Egyptians had leavened bread, which was given free to the population. But as is pointed out by Heinrich Jacob in his book 6,000 Years of Bread, every Egyptian lived in dependence upon the king, who had to give life to the Egyptian. The fact they had personal freedom had not yet been discovered. So type of interesting, the importance of bread in Egyptian life. And I don't know if you can see it, but right behind me, I've got the etymological dictionary of the English language, which talks about the origin of this idea of chem, chum, etc. But it makes a lot of sense that we put aside leavened bread, because that's a symbol of that slavery and dependence upon Pharaoh and the greatness of Egyptian culture. Another interesting feature is that when Joseph is taken out of prison, it says he is shaven. If you look just over there, you'll see that he is shaven. right? He shaved himself, changed his raiment. One of my kids actually asked why the Torah needs to tell me that detail. It seems to be unnecessary. It doesn't tell me he showered. They didn't have showers back then. But why? So the one answer to that is, I can't say it's the answer, but we know from Egyptian court protocols that the Egyptians completely shaved all of their hair, all of their facial hair, body hair, hair on their head, and they would paint on eyebrows using cosmetics. They had these artificial beards made of lapis lazuli, malachite, carnelian, and they would tape them, have them hooked over their ears. And all the court officials in Egypt were clean shaven. If you can see in the top left there, you'll see the guy who is completely clean shaven, whereas right next to me is an Assyrian foreigner, and he has got a prominent beard, as do his soldiers. The Egyptians, clean shaven. Now, interesting, the Torah says that the third plague, which was lice, the Khartoumim, Pharaoh's magicians or Pharaoh's advisors, immediately said, this must be the finger of God. Now, if you think about that, why did they say it was the finger of God with the third plague? Very simple. They had no hair whatsoever. How the heck are they getting lice? So they said, oh my, this must be from God. They were totally blown away by that. Now, also, the title, thanks to the Rosetta Stone, I'm not referring to the software, but to the actual stone found in Egypt called the Rosetta Stone, which had hieroglyphics and translation of them into Greek. So that was discovered in the 18th century, and that was able to be used by linguists and archaeologists to decipher hieroglyphics. So here above me is the name of Joseph. You read it from here, from this side, because hieroglyphics can be written both ways. You'd write like this. You can tell the beginning of the line because the faces of the ape, animals, and people figures always face the beginning of the line. So there you've got, and this is the title that the Torah says that Joseph received, which was Tsafanef Pa'ank, which means the Neph speaks, or God speaks, and he gives life. Now that's very appropriate, because Joseph, every single time he spoke, whenever anyone praised him, what was his response? His response always was, it's not me, it's God. So he spoke in the name of God. And in fact, in the Torah, it records that the Egyptians said to Joseph, after he distributed the grain, they said, Hechi Yisanu, you gave us life. In fact, you can see immediately above me right there, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but right there is the Egyptian Ankh symbol, which is the symbol for life. And that was part of the title of Joseph, he who spoke in the name of God and brought life. And in fact, his wife's name, Asenath, means belonging to God, belonging to Neph. His father-in-law is Potipharah, the given of the house of Ra, the sun god. And there is his name, right over there is his name in hieroglyphics, Potipharah. Notice the last symbol there is the disc of the sun, because he was a priest of the sun god Ra. And interestingly, the Torah says he lived in On, which is Ionu, On in Hebrew, Ionu in ancient Egyptian, and in the Greek Septuagint translated as Heliopolis, which means, of course, city of the sun, which makes a lot of sense as to where he would be living. Here is the famine stealer, which means it's an inscription describing a time of famine during the third dynasty, when all the land was given to Pharaoh in exchange for food, except for the land of the priests, which is type of interesting because it reflects what Joseph had decreed in Egypt. Here's a canal in Egypt. It's known as Bur Yusuf. It's the ancient name, is the canal of Joseph. Here are the pyramids. Just by the way, to dispel a misconception, we did not build the pyramids. The pyramids were there before the Jews were in Egypt, and the pyramids are made from cut limestone blocks. The slaves in Egypt, that's, by the way, that's me at the Pyramid of Giza, and that's me at the Great Pyramid of Memphis, Tennessee. It was the largest outdoor goods store in the world, fishing and camping in the pyramid. Memphis, of course, is the name of the ancient capital of Egypt. So I figured I would, visit both great pyramids. Anyway, so, but we didn't build the pyramids. I've got to tell you, they were actually built by aliens. But, so, however, how do we know this, that we didn't build the pyramids? Well, first of all, they were there before the Jews. But secondly, if you see this wall painting, these are slaves making bricks. Now, the bricks the slaves made were made of Nile mud, which, depending on how much clay, the consistency of the clay, you'd also need straw in it. So the Jews in the Torah are described as making bricks out of clay and straw, which were used for storage cities and dwellings, but were not used for the pyramids. But it's interesting, the Torah uses the term sivlotam numerous times, at least 3 or 4 that I remember. And the word sevel means to carry. The great work of the slaves was really the burden of carrying stuff, schlepping and carrying. And the Torah reflects that. And these are the paintings actually that you can see in Egypt, which indicate this, by the way, above me, Midianite traders who would bring goods from Israel, Canaan, to Egypt. Of course, the Torah says that Joseph was sold to Egypt by Midianite traders. There is an actual mud brick of the type that the Jews made. Can't say that was made by a Jew, but it is an ancient brick from Egypt, and you can clearly see the pieces of straw in there to hold it together and to give it greater and better consistency, as one of the mud bricks. Here you can see the magnificent, this is in Thebes, and but basically what you can see here are the manufacture of bricks. Right, literally above my head is the manufacture of bricks, and you see the slaves involved just 2 above, right over there. You see the slaves involved in carrying stuff, a lot of schlepping taking place. You see also slaves involved in agricultural labor, in building, and so on and so forth. It was a culture that was based on slavery. Now, here is a papyrus, which is in the Brooklyn Museum. And it's an interesting papyrus. It has it's an Egyptian household talking about their property they owned. And in the property they own, they include the names of 2 slaves. And they have each slave has 2 names, an Egyptian name, but also another name. So a Hebrew name. One slave is called Shifra and the other Asher. These are Hebrew names, which, by the way, is reminiscent to the Medrash. The Medrash says that the Jews refused to accept the Hebrew names. I don't know if anyone saw the wonderful, an old television series called Roots about the African-American slavery in America. Just very, very good. But one of the scenes that I remember there is the African slave whose name was Kunta Kinte, and his master tells him, "Your name is Toby," and he refuses to accept the name, and he's beaten to an inch of death, within an inch of death, until he finally accepts it. And that type of when I saw that, I was reminded of that midrash, that the Jews refused to accept the Egyptian names. And in that Brooklyn papyrus, you have these slaves with both Hebrew and an Egyptian name. This, by the way, on your Seder plate, you'll probably have a piece of roasted lamb. If you're a Sephardi, you may even eat roasted lamb. If you're an Ashkenazi, you do not. But that is a reminder of the Passover offering. The Torah goes to great lengths to say to the Jews they should bring a lamb. And it's interesting, the Torah is really careful about how we prepare it. It says, do not boil it. You must roast it whole on a spit. And the idea behind that makes a lot of sense. The Jews were ideologically enslaved, and they were psychologically enslaved. That is slave mentality. They were scared to death of the Egyptians, but they also believed in a lot of the Egyptian idols. So over there, as you see, is a large picture of the ram god Khnum, who was the lord of the first cataract of the Nile, who was venerated by the Egyptians, symbolized by the ram and the sheep. And indeed, you imagine the courage that the Jews had to show to take something which symbolized the Egyptian god and to roast it on a spit and roast it whole. So the Egyptians would smell it, they'd recognize it, they'd look over the fence of the Rubensteins and they'd say, oh my God, right there on the barbecue. And the Jews would, this was basically getting in the face of the Egyptians, dissing the man in his hood. And it was an important step for the Jews to actually display that type of courage, lack of fear, and to withdraw from idolatry. Just above, there are a couple of Egyptian artifacts from the British Museum. First of all the way at the end, you see a clay brick and some tools used for making bricks. You have a basket for carrying things. And also in the front, it's very interesting to see, this is a twisted staff in the shape of a snake. I don't know if you see all the end, at the end there, that is that's actually the snake's head, and the staff is twisted to look like a snake. And there you've got some mirrors made of bronze that women would use to apply cosmetics, etc. Actually, men as well in Egypt, come to think of it. Okay, we discussed that already. Here's Abu Simbel. We know also that, by the way, when the Jews came out of Egypt, the Torah describes them as being stuck. The Egyptian army is behind them. They have the desert to one side, to the south. They have to the north this cliff with idols carved into it, and in front of them is the Red Sea. So when you look at something like Abu Simbel and you see these massive statues, you can, and here are these Jews, slaves, the nation being slaves for over 200 years, right? You can imagine the fear they felt in seeing these the greatness of Egyptian civilization and how difficult it would be. This is, by the way, what's known as a plague pit from Tel El Daba, which indicates mass burials of bodies due to apparently a plague. Now, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Who let the Jews go? We don't actually know, because the Torah only refers to him as Pharaoh, which is just the title. And that was very common, by the way. Ancient manuscripts, very often they had what's called exoriation. They would not mention the name of the enemy. But the Torah also there's a pattern. There are many kings that the Torah mentions only by their title: Avimelech of the Philistines, Pharaoh of the Egyptians, etc. Be that as it may, there seems to be some evidence that maybe the Pharaoh of the Exodus was a guy called Pepai, otherwise known as Theops. Two pieces of circumstantial evidence. First of all, the Midrash says that the Pharaoh of the Exodus ruled for over 90 years, which I know sounds crazy, but it's interesting that in two Egyptian accounts, one is the Turin Royal Canon, and the other is the Epitome of Manetho, both refer to a Pharaoh Pepai who ruled for 90 years. It was not Ramses, no, probably not. But we don't know for sure, but probably not. And also another possible evidence that it was Pepai or Theops is that Egypt went into a massive decline and a lot of anarchy right after his reign ended, which of course makes sense. If they lost a lot of their slave labor and their agriculture was destroyed, you would imagine the country would be in a state of chaos for a little while. That's an artist's depiction of the crossing of the Red Sea. And if you cannot do the traditional gangland salute of the Jews, I question your genealogical integrity. I'm sorry. But in any case, okay, let's move on from this. It's very inspiring. Okay. There's also, the Torah tells us that the Egyptians pursued the Jews to a place called Pi Hachirot, and the Egyptians were confused, and that's where they were thrown into the sea. It's type of interesting. There is a granite shrine in Ismailia, which was discovered in the 1860s, and on the shrine it says, Pharaoh and his men fought the evil ones at the place of the whirlpool, and they call it Pi Charoti. Pharaoh is thrown by a whirlwind into the air and is no more. Now, Pi Charoti is tantalizingly close to the Hebrew Pi Hachirot, describing the similar event at the time of the Exodus. Now, the Jews come out of Egypt, and as you all know, they always described as wandering in the desert for 40 years. The truth of the matter is, about half the time the Jews were in the desert, they were in one place called Kadesh Barnea. If you can see here, you dwelt in Kadesh Barnea many days. And Rashi, right behind me, based on the Seder Olam, says that was actually 19 years. In fact, the only place in the Sinai desert where there are dwellings from that period of time are in Kadesh Barnea, which of course is where you'd expect them to be. The people who lived in Kadesh Barnea, interestingly, traveled northeast and crossed into what we call now Jordan and invaded Israel north of the Dead Sea. They attacked Jericho, Ai, Chatzor, and Megiddo, and these people are known as the mysterious Middle Late Bronze Age interchange people, MBI people. However, there are archaeologists who believe that the MBI people are not that mysterious after all. They're actually the ancient Israelites, and they are following the course that the Torah actually described. The Jews came into Israel, and they built, there are two twin mountains just north of the area of Jericho called Har Eval, Har Grizim, Har Eval, Mount Grizim and Mount Eval. The Jews assembled there and gave blessings and curses, re-accepted the Torah, so to speak. And we are told that Joshua built an altar on the top of Mount Eval. Now, it's interesting, Professor Adam Zertal of Haifa University, who did a lot of the work on this altar, has some fascinating arguments that this is the altar that Joshua built. And that is based on a few things. Number one, the stones of this altar are not cut stones. In fact, the Torah says, don't cut the stones of the altar, they should be raw stones. So this altar is not made of cut stones, it's made of raw stone. Secondly, I don't know if you can see it in the middle there, there is a ramp leading up to the altar, not stairs. The Torah says no steps up to the altar. Third, the only bones found around this are kosher mammals. And most interesting for us, at least, is also that around this altar were found some Egyptian jewelry and decorations. There's a scarab. So there's an altar in the location where the Torah says it should be, Mount Grizim, Mount Eval. And not only that, but we've found a lot of fascinating stuff. I'll see if I can send a PDF of that. So that is okay. Now, the Egyptians did not give up. About 100 years or so after the Jews entered Israel, we have a Pharaoh Merneptah who boasted of destroying the Jews. But what's fascinating about this particular, you see the smudge down there just above my head. I've enlarged it, and there is the enlarged version. And you can see they're facing this direction. And so you read it from here. It actually says the people, the nation Israel in the land of Canaan. That's three important points there. A, we are called a nation. B, we're called Israel. And C, we're living in Canaan. This is not long after the Jews got out of Israel. And one interesting just point, this is actually from Scientific American, written by a physicist by the name of Melody von Smith. She's at a party, and one of these conspiracy guys came over to her to argue with her about the moon landing, right? About the moon landing, and he was saying how it couldn't have happened. It must have been a fake. And so she was arguing with him, and she's a physicist, and he didn't know anything, right? So basically. But then she thought of the best argument that blew him out of the water. The best argument. She said, look, she said the following, the Russians. He said, what are you talking about? She said, look, who were the great enemies of the United States back then? Actually, okay, but back then they definitely were, right? Were the Russians. Who was in the space race? The United States was racing against Russia, right? To put a man on the moon, to put et cetera, et cetera. Now, in all of that time, did Russia claim that the moon landing was faked? They did not. She said, clincher. That's it. Submission hold. KO, done. All right. It's a great argument, and I'm using the same argument regarding Exodus. We have two accounts from famous. There's one Russian telling me it's fake. Okay, yeah. Okay. But too late. Back then they didn't say that. Okay. All right. Izvinite. What's interesting is that Manetho, who was fairly was not predisposed towards the Jews, he writes about the fact of this people who were these. They chose a ruler from amongst the priests of Heliopolis. They swore an oath that obey him in all things. The first law he gave was they should not worship the Egyptian gods, and they should not abstain from any of the sacred animals that the Egyptians held in high esteem. Fascinating. That sounds like a bit of a description of the Jews. And even more so, we've got a guy called Appian, Josephus Flavius, who, as you know, was a Jewish Roman historian. He actually wrote a book called Contra Appian, which was a refutation of Appian because he was so rabidly anti-Semitic. But this anti-Semite Appian, this ancient historian, talks about the Jews being in Egypt. And he says they didn't leave Egypt, they were thrown out of Egypt because they were corrupt, evil, perverse, horrible people. So, you know what? Okay. But what's interesting is here is an enemy of the Jews, not just admitting, but actually describing the Exodus, although he gives his own anti-Semitic twist on it, but it is interesting to see nevertheless. So that's a little bit of the what I think Isaiah meant, that you are my witnesses, says God, my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, and just a little bit of some insights into Egypt. I'll end with one more, which I didn't get a chance to put on the slide. But the name Moses, we know, was given to him by the daughter of Pharaoh, right? As you know. And she says, Moshe min hamayim mishitihu. I drew him out of the water. Now, what's quite interesting is that in ancient Egyptian, mu means water, and usus, mo means water, and usus means to draw. So it would fit in with ancient Egyptian. There are those who say also that the word mos means son of. That's why in Egypt you have a lot of names like Ahmos and Thutmose, etc., son of. So in addition, Philo Judaeus, who was a Greek Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria in Egypt in the couple of century before the first centuries BCE, he actually writes that he thinks that the Greek word muse, as in a supplier of wisdom, actually comes from Moses, which is type of an interesting possibility. He was the ultimate muse. He was the ultimate giver of wisdom to the world, but he was also Mos, as in son of, but he was also Mu and Mo and Usus, which is drawn from the water. And that's a little bit of Egyptian color, even in the name of our great rabbi teacher Moshe Rabbeinu Moses. He has an Egyptian name. It's type of interesting to contemplate that. You can talk about that at the Seder, right? That is the name given to him, and he's not known by any other name in the Torah, which is strange. Something to talk about. So anyway, that's a little bit of some background, to the Haggadah and to Pesach, and I wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a happy, kosher, wonderful Pesach, and that's it for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Becher.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I'm just personally curious, why do you think Moshe is not, the Medrash does discuss Moshe's Hebrew names, and it says he had several Tuvia and
Sure.
I forgot what else, but why is he?
Have you ever heard anyone call it? Right, he's never called by that at all. Right. So the Maharal of Prague discusses this at length, as he does with everything at length. But anyway, but one of the things he says is that it expresses the essential nature of Moses. You see, drawn from the water, he says, it's type of like saying he and water are opposites. You see, water is something which has no form. It's formless. It has no shape. Right? The shape of water, it's a movie, but water has no shape. It's formless. Right? Moses, the job of Moses, of Moshe, was to take the formless and give it form, purpose, goal, and shape. So he's called the one who is drawn from the water, meaning he's the anti-water in the world. Right? The Jews are in Egypt, they're chomer, they're like shapeless, they're purposeless, they're right? He takes them and molds them into a people, into a shape. Of course, what could be more symbolic of giving water shape than solidifying the Red Sea so the Jews can pass through? So that's the symbolism of Moshe. That's why that's the name that is used for him, because that's the essence of what he was. That's the Maharal's explanation. There may be other explanations as well, but that's the Maharal. Something to think about.
I believe there's a machlokes, Ramban and Ibn Ezra as well, about whether Moshe Minamayim Mishi Siru, is that a Hebrew word or is that an Egyptian word?
Yes, yeah, yeah. What I was quoting also was but again, in the writings of various, at least in Egyptian linguists, it could be that in Hebrew, there may be related languages. There are words which are similar, but linguists would seem to think that that usus means to draw from, and similar to mishitihu, but
Fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, if there are any other questions, or
Yeah, I have one for you, Rabbi.
yes.
So I have a pet theory that they don't refer to Pharaoh by name, because what's the point of getting into, the dynastic succession of some nation that isn't so important? Very compelling, of course, that it's one Pharaoh throughout much of the story, especially in light of the continuity in the later half and in the earlier bit as well, where, Joseph's people that he's aligned with kind of fall out of power. That at least speaks to a dynastic change.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things during the plagues, at one point, Moses is in a tizzy with the Pharaoh, who says, if I see you again, I'll kill you. And Moses is like, yeah, actually, you're right. You're never going to see me again. And then later, the great cry comes up in Egypt as a result of the last plague, and it describes Pharaoh as running down the hill, I presume to the place where the Jews were living, screaming, get out, get out, get out. And I wonder if it's possible, within the discussions that we've had handed down about this exchange, that was the new Pharaoh, that the Pharaoh was the firstborn at the time, and he was killed in the plague, and his little brother was like, oh wow, this is very serious, I've been advocating this for a long time, get out.
It's interesting theory. I mean, it's certainly it's possible, although I'm not familiar with any commentaries who do advance that theory. But again, I wouldn't.
You just met one, but strictly speaking, I don't know any other either.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. It just struck me also. I didn't talk about the plagues, and there's also a very, very an Egyptian nature to some of the plagues. Just by the way, Moses, you have to ask yourself if the daughter of Pharaoh, whose name was Becher, if she knew that it was a Jewish kid, and Yaldei, she says, Jewish kid, why is Pharaoh allowing her to bring up this Jewish kid in the court? So there is a theory, the Egyptians believed that the Nile was actually a god, and that the crocodile, there was also a crocodile god of the Nile, and they had a tradition of the crocodile god and the Nile mating and producing a god who would be their child. So she finds a baby in a basket, and in the Nile, he hasn't been eaten by crocodiles, and he's out of the Nile. Some say that maybe Pharaoh thought, what if this is the kid? What if he is the child of the union of the Nile and the crocodile? It's type of interesting. By the way, according to the Abarbanel, And this is based on Rav Sa'adjagon translated the Torah into Arabic. And in his translation to Arabic, he translates Sephardeia as the second plague, not as frog, but as crocodiles. That's a little more serious than being invaded by frog. It's like living in Florida, right? But that's a little more serious than the frogs, right? That's yeah.
I love that translation.
Yes, yeah.
And on the same note, Reb, I understand you have a background in medicine.
No, I do not.
Is that not so?
No, not at all.
Anyway, I'll segue into this other, unless somebody else has a question. I have a question about
I
Matis,
have a
go ahead.
Yeah, Mattis, yeah.
Yeah, hi. It's big schus, and I appreciate this subject. First of all, are you familiar with the book Riddle of the Exodus?
Yeah, I have seen it. I haven't read it. I've skimmed parts of it. Yeah.
More importantly, do you have an approach? Have you seen anything in terms of the Torah's switching from using the terminology of Pharaoh, and Melech Mitzrayim? Do you understand my question?
Yeah.
The inconsistency of it, I haven't found yet as somebody who takes that on.
Well, I do. I think that the Ksava Kabbalah discusses that, but you have to look at each individual case for the context, right? As to why in this case it's Melech Mitzrayim, in this case it's Pharaoh. I think he does. If you look in the Rav Yaakov Tzvi Meckelberg.
Yeah, I can look right now.
But
I have. I mean, myself personally, I have not found any kind of rationale for that, except for the one time where it says that the Jewish people, they cried because so I forgot, maybe it's the Ibn Ezra says that because it doesn't say the usual text of form of that the king. That the king died and the new king arose, so that perhaps that that there was. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by my kids. So I have not found any kind of pattern of sorts, but I will look at the Ksava Kabbalah right now.
I think
where would that be there? Do you have any idea?
I don't remember offhand.
Okay, all right, I'll skim through. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Becher.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Chag
Thank you very
Kasher
much.
Sameach.
Thank you.
And yeah.
If there's more questions here, I don't. If Rabbi Becher has time, then you can do it. I personally have to go to Davin Maariv right now.
I also have to.
I will not turn off my screen. So if you would like to stay around, please do.
Actually, I have to go as well. But anyway, Chag Sameach, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Chag Sameach, thank you.
Chag Sameach. Thanks.